this is a wonderful vista tonight because we have Peter Boyer joining us. Peter, a lot of things to distinguish Peter, but the most important thing is he's an Ole Miss alum. And that set him on a course for the rest of his life. How could he fail after having come here to Ole Miss? But Peter really is awesome because he has worked for big time national media that range from the New Yorker to Fox News and points in between. And there are just not many, if any, people who can lay claim to that fact. And that says something about our featured guest tonight. Wow. Peter and Curtis Wilkie, who is the founding fellow at the Overby Center, premier inaugural fellow. The two of them have a class that they teach in the Honors College this semester on Trump and the press. And as you might imagine, and it's appropriate that Curtis is to the left here and Peter is to the right, they have some animated conversations in that class. And so we're going to continue that conversation tonight and let you in on it. And then you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So we're going to have a lot of fun, and I think we're going to shed a lot of light on what is a hot topic. And I want to start, Peter, by asking you, how have you been able to work for such diverse philosophical outlets and succeed?
Well, that it was a very kind introduction you gave, Charles, which is really sort of another way of saying I can't hold a job. Yeah. I started out at the AP in Los Angeles, then the LA Times, CBS News, NPR, Vanity Fair, the New York Times, New York Times to, and Frontline I did while I was working at these other, Frontline's a PBS documentary series. You know,
one of them, maybe it's a new job you got coming in here.
I am so sorry, y'all. Yes. You won't believe who this was.
I did a program with Walter Cronkite, and he had that done, and he said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of this program." And he had set the whole thing up as a fake.
This was a person who was harder to get than the president, I'll tell you. But
okay.
After the, and then I went to work at the New Yorker magazine, where I worked most of my functioning life. And from the New Yorker, much to Curtis's chagrin, I went to the best job I ever had, which was at Fox News. And man, did I love it. I know that sounds crazy to perhaps some of you.
To Curtis.
It certainly did to Curtis. I mean, I saw him in the Grove. I forget what game it was, some Auburn game or something. I'd come down and I went over to his tent and I said, "Brother Curtis, I'm going to work at yet another place." "Well, where is it?" I said, "Fox News." And he started laughing, assuming that I was just, of course, making that up. What normal person would ever go to Fox? But at Fox News, I mean, this may be surprising to some, including you, but I'm a registered Democrat, registered right over at the Lafayette County Courthouse when I was a freshman.
So how do you square being a registered Democrat and working for Fox News?
Well, I suppose what you might call conservative. I consider myself an old-style Democrat. You know, I love my country. I'm not as woke, perhaps, as other people in my party on certain things. But I'm a registered Democrat to this moment. Curtis, on the other hand, is a registered Republican.
No, well, come on. Don't.
I did vote in the Republican primary twice this time, but I had ulterior motive.
as an act of political sabotage.
This program is not Ripley's Believe It or Not, so we want to get into this. Could you just walk us inside Fox News and tell us, obviously you said that was one of your best jobs. Tell us about Fox News.
You know, it was cool for me. I mean, I'd worked in television before. I made a bunch of documentaries, and CBS was fun. But the thing about Fox was, you know, it's right there in the belly of the beast. It's in, 6th Avenue. NBC's right across the street, and a couple blocks away is Times Square. And, it was a short walk from most of the places I had spent my career. But it was very insular. It was like a pirate ship. It didn't start until 1998. And everybody in there, I mean, there were people who knew how to work cameras, and there were people who knew how to work the teleprompter, and it was television on the one hand. On the other hand, everybody felt like, we're the pirates. Fox was and is constantly assailed by the outsiders. It had a pretty unabashed philosophy. Roger Ailes, my boss, the guy who brought me over there, founded it on the idea, and it was a smart one, turns out, that most of the mainstream media serves, half the country. Those people with sort of a progressive, liberal kind of worldview. And nobody serves the other half. Flyover country, the red states, people who go to church regularly, people go to college football games, farmers, working people, regular folks, people like Roger Ailes used to think of himself. He's from Warren, Ohio, middle America. And it turned out to be, just this multi-billion-dollar good idea. And going to work there, I worked on the news side, and the news side was as straight as any news side I'd ever worked on, straighter. I would make the argument that it still is. That I don't know, for example, if my dear friend Curtis ever watches much Fox, although you have lately come to watch some Fox,
I
right?
have a choice sometimes, but I agree. I think that if you get away from that line of people in the evening, Brett Baer has got a perfectly reasonable news program at 5, and
Shepard Smith, Ole Miss person.
Shepard Smith.
Shepard Smith.
Shepard Smith's as
Ole
liberal
Miss
as
is,
anybody on the air, and Shepard, unlike most other newsmen at Fox, actually expresses his point of view. Most newsmen and women at Fox don't. I mean, they still stick to the old standards of this is what happened and I'm going to tell you about it. That's not Sean Hannity and those guys. They, of course, are opinionists. But I'm just telling you, I told you where I've worked, and I'm honestly telling you, Fox News, the news part of it was as straight as any place I've worked. The atmosphere was weird, though. I mean, it was television, so it was kind of false. I mean, in television, it's just a false environment. It's not real. You look into a camera and you pretend to be conversational, and you put on your big boy broadcast voice, and you're, looking into this little red light as if it's something besides a piece of machinery with a little red light. And that makes you kind of, that's a sort of, but apart from just the television aspect of it, there was this other thing that, people at Fox News, the kids who would come in, some of them were so bright, some of my young producers could have worked anywhere, but they wouldn't think of, applying to NBC or CBS because they had Fox News on their resume, and, which is a shame, but I liked it. By the way, the only place I've ever been fired was Fox News, so I still love it.
But you went out with Roger Ailes.
Roger got walked out of the building for reasons that are, I think, now fairly well known. There have been, 17 movies and a Netflix series and a Showtime series and everything. And the next day or 2 days later, I had a documentary unit, and it was during the 2016 Democratic convention, and we put on a special about the Democrats. So Roger, I think, left on a Thursday or Friday, and my immediate boss, the executive vice president of news, and I, because we were Roger people, were walked out a couple days later, along with lots of other folks. And then the Murdochs, Mr. Murdoch, took it over, basically running it himself. And he sold the place, and now it's this sort of orphan company that I have the feeling might be sold to some group sooner or later.
Well, we want to circle back to Fox News, but everybody here is anxious to hear about you and Curtis and Trump and the press. So I want to just start, as news people do, with the lead. I'm guessing that with your students, the two of you had a different view on the Trump impeachment. And so, Peter, the Trump impeachment is kind of brings everything together, the press and his outlandish behavior and the Democrats' ability to try to get him. What's your view of what's going on here with impeachment? And then I want to hear from Curtis, and then I'll let y'all just converse as you do in your class.
Well, I suppose partly because Curtis is what my dear late mother used to call a well-reared individual. We don't actually come to fisticuffs or anything.
Not yet.
It's early in the semester.
We do disagree. I guess on pretty much everything when it comes to Trump and the press. I have some pretty pointed thoughts on it, and I have to say I'm right.
So tell them what your pointed thoughts are.
Last time I was here, I'm in this weird position that's, in some ways, it's such wonderful fun, but it's also kind of strange, which is I live in Westchester County, New York, and I commute to Ole Miss, which is, so there have been a couple of weeks when I'm not here. And I guess I was last year, I'm sorry if I'm banging this in a way that's piercing any eardrums, but can y'all hear me okay? Last time I was here, I guess, was a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3. And in that time, I'm getting to your question about the impeachment. In that time, Charles, we went through an entire impeachment crisis. Not Trump. 3 weeks ago, when I was last here, nothing. Then, one Sunday morning, there was an impeachment crisis with Justice Kavanaugh. And that had everything to do with the press, everything to do with what is my thesis, I think, I guess you would say, this fall semester, that Trump has broken the norms of the presidency, plainly has. We've never had a president who looked like him, talked like him, sounds like him, tweeted like him, who does stuff like he did today. Somebody says to him, Mr. President, good reporter, the guy from Thomson Reuters, says to him,
Peter did a piece for Esquire
earlier this year says to him, Mr. President,
on the cover.
Do you think everybody who disagrees with you is treasonous? Or something like that, because Trump had said something like that. And he said, a lot of people say I can't speak very well, but a lot of people think that I am a very stable genius. He says this, he said it before, but he says this sort of as this non sequitur kind of thing. He has plainly broken the norms of what we consider presidential behavior. And you may feel about that however you wish. But my contention is that in reaction to that, this president has baited, either intentionally or otherwise, he has baited some of our most important institutions. Our most important institutions, in fact, including the press, into breaking their norms in order to stand in opposition to him. And I think there are just really bad consequences from that. And, which gets me to the Kavanaugh thing. I mean, one Sunday morning, America sort of woke up and did what they do. They went to church and ate pancakes, or didn't go to church and played golf, whatever they do on Sunday mornings. And by the end of the day, there was this, 5-alarm fire going on because the New York Times had published that day on the front page of its Week in Review a story from two of its reporters that had included this explosive new bit of information that Justice Kavanaugh, when he was young, back in college, had yet another previously unknown sexual assault incident. He was at a party, there was drinking, there were other people involved. I won't get more graphic than that, but it involved groping, let's put it that way. By the end of the day, several Democratic presidential candidates were calling for his impeachment, which instantly, of course, then the press and then everybody was trying to match the Times story, and it was like a 5-alarm fire, this full frenzy mode for 2 days, until it turned out that there were problems with the story. Among other things, the victim in this instance had not filed any sort of complaint, that the source for the story turned out to be a person who wasn't there, wasn't an eyewitness, who had just heard it from people at the time. And by the way, this source also turned out to be a Democratic lawyer who was one of those who helped Bill Clinton in his defense in the impeachment process. And most importantly, to me anyway, the victim herself not only didn't file a complaint, but said she had no memory of this thing ever even happening. And the two reporters knew all of this stuff I just said to you, and it wasn't in the piece. And the Times had to do an editor's note, and they explained it as this was an editor who omitted this stuff, and sorry, oops, and the story sort of went away. But you ask yourself, how in God's name could such a thing happen at the New York Times? And the answer is, as a matter of fact, this is why. This is a story, August 7th, 2016. Trump is testing the norms of objectivity in journalism by Jim Rutenberg, front page of the New York Times. And let me just read you the lead. If you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue, playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how in the heck are you supposed to cover him? Because if you believe all those things, you have to throw out the textbook of American journalism and approach it in a way you've never approached anything in your career. If you view a Trump presidency as something that's potentially dangerous, then your reporting is going to reflect that. You move closer than you've ever been to being oppositional. Now, he's sort of posing this question, but you knew how the Times answered this question within just a couple of weeks, because they were suddenly calling Donald Trump a liar, using that term, in their news columns, in their actual news stories, and in their headlines. Something that, if you're not in the news business, you don't know what a leap, what a crossing of the Rubicon that is. It's a big deal. It's true that I worked at the New York Times many centuries ago, but as recently as 2015, the Times had what they call the style book, but it was the Bible of your practices, your standards, your rules for being a journalist. And it was crucial to the Times' perceived place as being the national paper of record. And it was insistent upon maintaining a voice of distanced neutrality, impartiality. As recently as 2015, this rule book, which basically became the rule book for all the news business, insisted, let's say you're writing about abortion. You could not use the terms pro-life or pro-choice because they were considered too loaded. You're really, you're getting opinion in there. You can't say, you had to be exactly explicit. That was 2015. That's the 2015. And I think it's safe to say that the Times has pretty well sort of trashed that. And what happened in 2015? Donald Trump emerged on the scene. Now, y'all may think or not think that Donald Trump is an existential threat to this country. Plainly, the Times newsroom came to that conclusion. And when you believe that, when you become basically and lead other news organizations, they all follow the Times, when you become what half the country at least thinks of as being the bulletin board for the resistance.
Peter, without risking behaving like Rudy Giuliani, I'm going to have to jump in here.
Please
Sat
do.
here patiently for a little while. Let's go to the Kavanaugh story.
Yes.
That was not a news story. That was in the opinion section of the New York Times.
It was in the Week in
was-
Review.
it was-
It was an essay.
It was an essay. It was not a news story.
It was an essay by two of the Times news reporters.
Let me finish. They have written a book, and it's an excerpt from the book. It's based on material in a book. The business of the mystery woman took up one paragraph in a complete story, probably 3,000 or 4,000 words. They messed up. Our class dissected that story. We all agreed. I don't know whether you were still there when we did it, but we decided the Times made 3 bad editorial decisions. One, they had this tasteless promotional blog that called attention to it in the first place. Secondly, they did fail to point out as clearly as they should have about the unnamed woman. It was because they have a policy at that newspaper. They don't print the name of any woman who is allegedly involved, is a victim of a sexual abuse. So
Would you care for a delicious macaroni?
the name was there.
No.
The name was there, and the Times pulled it out. In doing so, they erroneously took out the line about how she was not willing
They
to talk
erroneously
about it.
took out the line.
And
Okay.
they that was an error. Editorial errors happen all the time. We are not perfect, but we generally own up to our errors, and they did very quickly owned up to those errors on Kavanaugh. So much of what you're talking about, involves failing to make a distinction between what shows up in editorial pages and what shows up in straight news stories. And there is a difference. And you're right, the Times did something I was never able to do when I worked for newspapers, to call something a lie. You just didn't use that term, a lie. When the Times uses that term lie, they demonstrate that it is a lie. This guy lies all the time. The Washington Post has been tracking it. The last time I heard something like it's up to 12,000, 14,000 lies in less than three years in office. No less than Brit Hume, I heard on Fox News the other night, says, sure, there have been lies, there just haven't been 12,000 of them. The guy lies all the time. They just chose to get real tough. We always had to call it. Ronald Reagan, for example, was constantly coming up with wacky things he said, but it was basically benign what Reagan said. And we would say that he made a questionable observation or something like that, and would point out that.
Well, why didn't you just say Ronald Reagan lied?
Because we didn't.
Why didn't you?
It was not done.
But apart from the fact of the proprieties of an old-time newspaper, what were the reasons for not calling him a liar? President Ronald Wilson Reagan lied again today.
Well, we could have proven that he did, but a lot of it was just kind of balmy behavior.
So you never thought about the thought about the underlying premises of
Trump's lies are malevolent. They're destructive. They're divisive, and I think the press is doing a pretty damn good job myself. And he's the guy that calls us the enemy of the people. That's a phrase that came from Stalin. He calls us scum. He calls us slime. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be jelly-like and say, "Oh yes, Mr. President, hit us again." Yeah. Hell no, you're not going to take it. You're going to fight back.
So we have the concession that, in fact, my point is proved. Trump has baited the once neutral media into becoming the opposition party.
I'm
not here carrying Trump's hod, believe me.
No,
what I'm saying is he has baited the press into abandoning their norms. Let me just respond to what you said about, well, it was on the editorial pages.
I got no apology for the job the press is doing. I think they're doing a damn good job.
Plainly, you don't, and I think.
And you've got Fox News. If you don't like what everybody else is doing, you can watch Fox News.
I guess that's one way of looking at it, Curtis. I think that is true. You have Fox News, and if Fox News went away, you would have Breitbart or Drudge or something. But that's sort of trivializing what I think is a very important point, which is we are in an impeachment crisis right now. I mean, at this moment, for God's sakes, we are thinking of, as Jerry Nadler said, the Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee said just a year ago, you don't go into impeachment lightly because that is the overturning of an election. It just, almost by definition, it is. And you're going to have half the country thinking, my God, you stole the election from me. We are in that crisis right now.
Did we invent the whistleblower? Did the press invent the whistleblower? They're covering the whistleblower.
And right now, it is
whistleblower
important.
is a government official.
All right. Okay, Rudy, tell me when you're finished.
I'm just saying, we didn't invent this crisis. The press didn't do it, and you basically suggested in class yesterday that the press is stoking it because they're carrying baggage for the Democratic Party.
That is not only true. That is not what I said in class yesterday. Is not only true; it is demonstrably true. But let me finish my sentence. We're in an impeachment crisis now. I don't care if it's President Bernie Sanders, whoever it is. An impeachment is a big deal in our system, in our republic. If you overturn a presidency, that's a big deal. It's important, and it's useful to have a news media, a journalism that is perceived by a consensus of Americans as being, if not a neutral arbiter, at least a fair scorekeeper, at least a fair presenter of fact. And what I'm suggesting is that in the Trump era, much of the media, certainly the mainstream media, has, in surrendering its norms and abandoning its norms, has abandoned that position. And
have they lied?
Yeah, you could make the case that by omission, by the way, this story you mentioned, making these fine newspaper man distinctions between, well, we all know on the inside that there's a difference between an essay on a Sunday and a thing and a journalist. Those were 2 Times reporters whose bylines were on that thing. B, it was a Times editor who made the decision. C, the consumers on the most prominent page on that Sunday paper, outside of the front page, the Week in Review, are not asked to make. You all be as insider as we are and make the distinction between what's opinion and what's an essay and what's not. And D, by the end of the day, the Democratic presidential nominees had picked up on this and had made it a news story that everybody else was following. You do remember that. It was just 3 weeks ago. And that's, again, I'm not saying that the Times had put this on front page as being holy writ, but I am saying they put it on front page with their reporters' bylines on it. There may have been reasons why they omitted this kind of semi-important fact that the woman didn't actually make the accusation, but didn't even remember this thing ever even happening and all these other things. I'm sure there are reasons for that, and yes, people make mistakes. Is that a lie? Not necessarily, but again, I'm not accusing the news media being liars.
Anything in the coverage of this current crisis goes back to the whistleblower. Is the press lying? Are we lying?
I don't read enough of every single story to know whether there's lies or not. I do know that the press is absolutely 100% helping the narrative of Ukraine is the reason why you finally.
Let's go back to the last impeachment.
Wait a minute, Curtis.
With Bill
you asked
Clinton.
me a question. Let me answer.
No, you're talking about how the press is basically in bed with the Democratic Party. The press covered relentlessly the Lewinsky scandal 20 years ago, and helped create a situation where the.
I see. The President of the United States of America is found out to be having oral sex in the Oval Office, and the press isn't going to cover it.
Where did this come from?
I mean,
I thought we were talking about Trump.
that was.
I was almost asleep over here, Uncle.
Curtis's answer to my assertion that this press, and it's a fairly straightforward assertion that I think is demonstrably true. I'm not pro-Trump. All I'm making is the case that Trump is so. Honestly, we can talk afterwards if you wish, but that Trump is so shattering of the norms that several key institutions, and I would argue the Department of Justice and the intelligence community and many others, have shattered their norms in order to resist him. Again, maybe he is Hitler. Maybe they're doing the right thing in doing so. I don't know.
I'm not sure you and Curtis are that far apart on that observation.
I don't think
Curtis
so,
has said that the press has done this out of necessity. You've said they're becoming an oppositional
Well, let's consider
party.
Ukraine. Let's consider this current crisis, which, by the way, didn't exist 2 weeks ago. And who knows, if we met here again 3 weeks from now, one thing we know is there will be some other crisis, if not this one. If this one is resolved, there will be some other one, and it'll be whatever. Trump ordered mustard on his Chick-fil-A or whatever.
What did Trump ask the people in Ukraine to do? Ask them to go after Hunter Biden.
Well, here's what we know.
How did Trump know about Hunter Biden and his dubious connections in the Ukraine?
All right.
We talked about this in class, and he learned about it through a story in the New York Times in 2015.
That is such a load that we could actually charge people to take shovels full of it for manure.
Here
that
it
is.
is.
That is good. I'm not saying the New York Times didn't ultimately do a story, nor the New Yorker.
Did a story
I happen to
raising
know.
all sorts of questions about Hunter Biden.
Okay.
And this is supposed to be,
Later on, when you run
carrying
into
the
Curtis,
Democratic
ask him if he actually
load.
wants me to answer his question, because I'm perfectly willing to answer. Oh, Curtis, you want me to answer your question? I mean, how did we come to know about the Ukraine story? Was your first part? Well, we learn today that the whistleblower. Here's how this story unfolded into our consciousness as news consumers. The first thing we heard is that there was a whistleblower in the intelligence community who had come forward. The first thing we heard in the news had come forward. My God, this was just less than 2 weeks ago. Had come forward, and then we heard a report that it had something to do with Ukraine. That's what we heard. That's all we knew. And then we got bits and pieces of leaks. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Washington Post. We heard that this had to do with the conversation between Trump and the president of Ukraine. We heard that it had to do with Biden. We heard that there was a promise that Trump made. We heard that it had to do with withholding of something if he didn't go after Biden. We heard that the going after Biden wasn't just looking back at 2016, but was in fact having to do with the 2020 campaign. We heard that it was a quid pro quo. We heard that he asked, and this is a direct quote from the Wall Street Journal story, that he asked about Joe Biden's son 8 times. That's what we heard before we knew anything else. This all happened very quickly. All of that we heard not because Adam Schiff got on the phone with us personally, 33 million, but because the news media reported that in bits and pieces. That was the story over the course of 48 hours. Trump releases the transcript. The transcript doesn't look anything like that. Joseph Biden is mentioned twice in the course of the actual conversation. And there came a lot of other noise, and there came things about, well, who knows if this is really a transcript or not. The next day, there is a hearing in which the acting director of national intelligence is the star witness. And Adam Schiff, the chairman of the committee, begins, by this time the whistleblower's complaint has been released. The whistleblower's complaint represents only a vague relation to the actual conversation. And then we find out that part of the reason for that is the whistleblower wasn't party to the conversation, hadn't read the transcript, didn't know, but had only heard from other sources about this conversation. We're now seeing the whole nation is tuned into the hearing featuring the D&I in which, and Adam Schiff, the chairman, begins the hearing by reenacting what he says is the conversation. And he playing the role of Trump, he's talking on the president, he says, I want you to dig up dirt on my opponent. And he basically repeats the narrative that they have been selling to the press, and that the press has, in most cases, been dutifully repeating, and to the point where Schiff had to come back in the hearing and say, in case anybody didn't know it, that was just a parody that I was performing. And that is my answer to your question. The press absolutely, demonstrably, just read the stories.
And we
now know, by the way, as of today, the one other piece that we know is that the whistleblower didn't go to the New York Times or didn't go to DNI. You know who the whistleblower went to? Adam Schiff. The whistleblower's first, his or her, I think whistleblower's probably a woman CIA officer, but who knows, went to Adam Schiff and his staff. And
how do you know that? It's been reported.
Yes, by Fox News. And now confirmed. By the way, by Adam Schiff.
Fox News is part of it's a legitimate news organization.
Absolutely. My God, I quit then. I've now gotten Curtis to say Fox News is a legitimate news organization.
I've got no problem with their reporters. I've got problems with that relentless commentary in the evenings, and the same
I invite you to watch CNN or
MSNBC
or any of them.
We talk
but
about
that's a cable television problem, not a. If you consider it a problem, I mean that's a family argument that happens on cable television.
Yeah, and it's a food fight on both networks. But we know this because news organizations are reporting it.
Do you think, Peter, that Trump has gone way overboard by labeling the press as the enemy of the people?
Of course. Yes. Listen, when I was at the New York Times, Curtis may remember this. I know you do too. There was an outfit called Accuracy in Media. This right-wing thing, Reed Irvine was the guy. And he used to routinely complain to my bosses at the New York Times about me being a radical liberal. And that Peter Boyer, and one of my colleagues, one of the very few conservatives at the New York Times, went off to work for a Forbes publication called Forbes FYI, and he did the same thing. Peter Boyer, left wing, an unreconstructed McGovernite, he called me. And the difference is, you'd say, you wish people weren't saying stuff, name calling you. But the thing is, I knew that wasn't going to hurt me professionally. It never occurred to me that it would hurt me professionally. It didn't cross my mind that this would be a bad thing. Because everybody else at the New York Times and the New Yorker, we were all we were in the club. What Trump's doing, let's put it this way. President Barack Obama, who, to understate the case, did not draw an equal measure of criticism from the press that this president has drawn. He actually surveilled reporters. I mean, not only my colleague James Rosen at Fox News, but the AP reporter, and I mean, they bugged James Rosen's parents' telephone, all in the interest of, you'll remember these cases, finding out who was talking to the press, who was leaking to the press. This is Barack Obama. That's real damage. You know, that interesting person who Curtis always says he won a Nobel Prize, the Times columnist Krugman, this week said we have two choices. One is Trump is going to be put away in prison, or American journalists are going to be hauled off and put into prison camps. I mean, you know, give me a break. Journalists go into this game because, you know, we are lazy and unfocused people, and it's fun. You get to go see stuff and do stuff, and you don't get bored, and you get to tell stories, and then you move on to the next one. Nobody is actually, you think Jim Acosta is actually afraid that something is going to happen to him? Do I wish Trump wouldn't say that stuff? Of course. Is it offensive? Yes. Might it encourage some crazy people to say they really are the enemy? Yes. But I don't think that it's anything like an existential threat. I'd much rather have a president call me names than to have them, you know, wiretap my mother's phone. Yes.
I want to go to the audience because I know you've got lots of good questions out there. And Curtis and I have plenty of questions here. But who'd like to start off with a question from the audience? Let's not be shy. Let's jump in there. Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, say that again.
The question for our TV audience is, Curtis, do you have any follow-up?
Do you have any
No, we're having dinner afterwards. I'm going to poison Peter.
I am, after all, an enemy of the people.
Yes, ma'am, over here.
Okay, so we have our broadcasting, mainstream broadcasting. We even have the national public broadcasting, national public radio, and over 90% of the time, everything I hear is some negative stuff. Never anything positive. Now, these CEOs of those organizations make 2 to 3 times what Trump makes in a presidential salary.
Trump takes $1 of his salary. Takes $1.
Yeah, but I mean, the presidential salary
Yes.
itself is
Yeah.
$400,000, and they're making 2 and 3 times that amount in their salaries off of our public broadcasting stations, which is publicly supported by our taxpayer money. Trump did say he was little teeth, and he would try to take it away, but that's, of course, congressional action. That's not something he can do. He can make his objections known, you know, to the budget.
So Jack has arrived just in time for you to ask your question.
So the question is there any hope that we will have the mainstream media go back to the journalism norms of reporting?
That's a very good question, and my answer is yes and no. Yes, the minute a Democrat is elected, and no, it won't matter. By then, they will have so wasted, we will have so wasted our credibility with the whole of the country, with what I call the consensus audience, that it won't matter. I mean, I don't know how the New York Times ever goes back to being the New York Times speaking with authority again. I just don't know how that can happen to half the country. Now, it turns out to them, it's a good short-term business plan. I mean, they have a very, as Jill Abramson, who spoke to our class a couple of weeks ago, former executive editor of the Times, as she put it, they have a very woke newsroom. And the woke newsroom keeps driving them more in the AOC direction. And that turns out to be a good thing for their online subscriptions, because part of their audience wants to just hear this stuff all the time. Orange man bad. But the thing is, Orange man's going to go away. It may be next week. It may be at the end of next year. It may be in the middle of the next decade if he gets a second term. But Orange man, he going away. And then comes what? And then what does the New York Times do? I mean, one of the things we learned when Dean Baquet had
Editor of the New York Times.
the New York Times current boss, editor-in-chief, they had one of their many incidents, which we won't get into, that was an embarrassment. And they had accurately covered a Trump speech after the shootings in Ohio and Texas. And their base got so much, the Twitter crowd prevailed, and they had to change a headline, and that caused some problems. And so we had a newsroom-wide meeting. And in this meeting, he said, in the English language, in fairly plain words, we built this newsroom to make the case, to show the case of Trump-Russia. That was why we built this newsroom. That's now over after the Mueller report and certainly the Mueller testimony. And now we are going to rebuild it. We can do it. We're going to rebuild it to something else. And the something else they were going to rebuild it to, because it was the topic du jour at the moment, was Trump racism. And the racism that's rampant in the country and how it's animating this president and animating his supporters. In other words, we're going to build our newsroom. Our newsroom is built in the mode of anti-Trump. And I guess I just say, Trump goes away eventually. And then what do? Okay, that's done. We are now speaking, we are now the eminence grise of journalism again. Trust us on this. And I just don't think that happens. I think that
I think they've gone down to the status of the Inquirer.
Well, the Inquirer has its own problems in the other direction.
Question over here.
I wonder if you would comment on the role of the local small-town press in all of this
Great
controversy. I have one question. I'm not sure my obligation as a reader, but if a local small-town newspaper purchases political cartoons, are we to believe that those political cartoons reflect the position of the local small-town newspaper?
My experience, Curtis, you answer this too. My experience is the cartoonists, being artists, live in their own world. God bless them. They're wonderful. Sometimes they reflect a consensus, but certainly not the consensus necessarily of the community. As to your first question, it breaks my heart what's happened with, the museum that which Charles knows so much. One of the cool things they have is you could go on and see, I guess you still can, I hope, see front pages around the country. Just as an exercise, I invite you all to do this. You remember the day in the spring of 2017 when Trump fired Jim Comey. Jim Comey, who had been the Barack Obama's, and before that, I think W's FBI director, and Trump fired him. And the front page of the New York Times the next day was, it included words like echoes of Watergate and the end of the world, try. I don't think they put impeachment on the front page that day, but they soon thereafter did. Go to Newseum and look at the local papers in Racine, Wisconsin, and Peoria, Illinois. I'm not kidding. No mention at all on the front page, or else a little reefer up at the top. It's a fascinating exercise because what they're talking about is stuff that's actually important to their community. One of the great tragedies of our time, to me, is the ill health of local newspapers, because they precisely because of the answer to your question, they reflect the communities and what's important to their readers, as opposed to the nonsense that exists on the Eastern Seaboard.
I have in my pocket.
Basically, they're served by, most of them would be served by the Associated Press. It's where you get to news outside the community, and the best thing that the community newspapers offer is news about your own community. But if you're reading about President Trump in a community newspaper, you're usually going to be reading it from the Associated Press. And I would suggest that the Associated Press is not a whole lot different from what you see in the New York Times. They are basically covering the news and reporting it and trying to report it as accurately as possible. And so I think you'll see the same sort of news reflected in the community newspaper as you would the New York Times or the Washington Post.
There was a hand up here in the middle.
With different emphasis, though.
Who?
In journalism, we talk about there's no stop, only go. And you have to look at the past to see where you're going for the future. And the press and the journalism world today is always like changing and expanding. So wouldn't journalism get to where it is today without Trump becoming president?
Very good question. The answer is the New York Times and MSNBC and those folks wouldn't be. I mean, they say it. Dean Baquet says, as does the latest Sulzberger, whichever generation is running the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I mean, by becoming more niche, by becoming, if you will, high-end Huffington Posts, they serve a particular audience that wants to hear Orange Man bad over and over and over again, as many different ways as you can do it. And it is. I mean, I'm overstating it a little bit, but in the short term, it's been a good business model for them. And on the other side, Fox News has thrived in the Trump era. Cable news, MSNBC would have 0 viewers if it weren't for Trump. I mean, you know, Morning Joe was a show that during the campaign, y'all know Morning Joe on MSNBC in the morning, Mika and Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough. And every day during the campaign, I mean literally every day, Trump would call in. And they knew what they were doing. Trump was, you know, he was ratings, and it was fun and interesting. And then, of course, he gets elected, and they join the Orange Man bad thing. And Trump, who is not a professional politician and who is an unconventional president, to say the least, one of the things he knows is that, and he knows that he's good for ratings. What happens next afterwards, again, that's why I keep sounding this theme. You know, I don't know what happens next, but unless there's another Trump-like figure out there, I don't think it's going to be so good.
Yes, sir.
I get the impression that you're trying to tell us that to ignore, because Trump gets all this negative publicity, all this negative coverage, that we should ignore all these stupid things that he says. He started, right out of the chute, he started with the inauguration crowd, said it was the largest in the history of the world.
Yes.
And he got mad because they took pictures of it. He attacks the mayor of London. It's just one stupid thing after another. And what are we supposed to do? Just ignore that happens?
Absolutely not. One stupid thing after another, I would wholly concur. I began this session today by referring to something he did today. I mean, really? You're the President of the United States and you get asked a question, and a reasonably legitimate question in my mind, by a very straight reporter, and your answer is, many people think I'm a very stable genius. I mean, that's just goofy as hell. It's a goofy thing for anybody to say, and it's a really goofy thing for the President of the United States to say.
But the other thing is,
And so, wait a minute. So your question is, do you just ignore that? No, you don't just ignore it. But you report it and let it speak for itself. And what I'm saying is, I think that the press has gone a step beyond that into something like open opposition. And that, I think, is crossing a Rubicon that everybody in our business will regret having done.
Yes, sir, back here.
My lovely wife to the right of me is cringing as I hold this microphone. Curtis, I'm George
We all
John-
relate.
Yeah. So, Curtis, I'm George Johnston from Clarksdale, and you mentioned to me what is the press supposed to do when Trump jumps in your face? And I would say we're talking a different paradigm. We're talking about a gentleman that is not the norm of any other president in our lifetime, but I think the press can't take it. They cannot reconcile themselves to say, hey, maybe we need to think of another way to go at this. And as a young lady down on the front quoted, all we hear is bad, bad, bad. We don't hear about employment. We don't hear about the numbers. We don't hear about security. We don't hear anything that he's done as far as breaking down regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. All we hear is bad. So from my perspective, Curtis, somebody's in the press has got to man up and say, maybe he's not all that wrong, a little bit. Let's listen to the guy because he's done a lot for our country, but the press likes to pile on. So what's the press going to do when Yellow Man goes away?
But I would suggest the press would do with Trump the way they would do with any other president, and as they usually have done, is to cover him as fully as possible, and when he has something constructive to say, report that in the same light that you report these kind of goofy things that he says. All you got to do, if we had a year's worth of papers, you find all sorts of stories that nobody that don't reflect badly on Trump. They report straight what's going on, what initiatives his administration's taking. Not everything is negative, and somebody may have that impression, think we're beating up on Trump, but there are plenty of stories that just portray him completely straight.
Curtis, I take exception to that. I haven't seen them. Pew Research does a lot of coverage as to what's negative, what's positive. How much do you think positive coverage Barack Obama got as a percentage of what President Trump got in his first 6 months of inauguration?
It depends on what you consider, a pro or a negative. But I would say that Obama was not having a meeting at the White House discussing how to keep people out of the U.S. Immigrants. He's at the story today. He's going to put snakes and alligators in the Rio Grande. He's instructing the border police to shoot these people, shoot them in the legs. You didn't hear that stuff from Obama because Obama was not a wild man.
Right. In other words, Curtis's answer to that question is yes. Curtis's answer is yes. The coverage of Obama was, and by the way, what Curtis just said is completely fake news. But yes, the coverage of Obama was wildly enthusiastic, certainly for the first 6 months. And yes, the coverage of Trump has been
and Trump spent a great deal of time
negative,
with his
Trump
thing trying to discredit a black president.
Oh,
Creating all this fog about how he was not born in the U.S., et cetera, et cetera.
We're going to have a last question from the audience right here.
I'd like to hear from each of you. Would you consider it negligent on the behalf of the press to not cover the president's statements at press conferences?
To not cover what he says at press conferences?
Not repeat what is being said, like the crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Would it be negligent on the behalf of?
I do think it would be negligent. I think it would be negligent, and it would be, a dereliction. I mean, obviously, the President of the United States says something. I will say a couple of things about that, though. First of all, this president, far more, and our kids in our class, unless you're not allowed to call them kids, our students in our class have heard this over and over and over again from me, and Curtis hasn't disagreed because it's absolutely true, is that this president is, for better or worse, the most accessible president we've ever had. I mean, you don't want to know what else he's thinking, but he's still telling you what he's thinking all 24 hours a day. 3 o'clock in the morning, he's telling you exactly what's on his mind. And the interesting thing, by the way, about when you hear about his private conversations, such as with the Ukrainian president, it turns out to be that's exactly the same stuff he's been saying in public. I mean, yes, we absolutely have the obligation. It would be a dereliction not to report what he says, including the crazy stuff. But to go back to that gentleman's comment, one of the things Trump did in his first 6 months was, by executive order, to say to the regulatory state, to the administrative state, okay, there are way too many regulations. You can't mow your lawn in some places in the back without getting a ruling from the EPA. No more of that. For every regulation that you impose, that you promulgate, you have to undo. He said this to all of his agencies. For every new regulation that you're going to impose, you have to undo 2 regulations. Now, that's a big deal that has a huge effect in our country. Show me the torrent of stories that came out in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, ABC, CBS. It was just kind of Trump being a right-winger who's listening to his right-wing activists. But that's a big deal. The reason it didn't become a story because it was, most people in most newsrooms don't agree that the administrative state needs to be pulled back. And there are a lot of people, I would say half this country at least, who thinks that the administrative state is overreaching. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of instances in which this president has done the things that Republicans have been promising. Who would have ever guessed it? He's not even a real Republican. But he has done things that Republicans have been promising for decades and haven't been able to pull off. I mean, I think it's important if you're able to distinguish Trump the person from Trump's actual governance. It's very difficult to do, and it's difficult because he is such a goofball. It's hard to do that. But if you're able to distinguish between those things, it's interesting.
Curtis, I assume you think that all should be recorded.
Yeah, I hope I made it clear that, yes, I think we absolutely have an obligation to cover anything. And I will just say again, we know all these things. We know about this regulatory maneuver by the president because the press reports it. We have a free press, and they're doing their job and reporting it. That's how we know everything. But we don't get this from osmosis. We get it from a free press.
I want to close by asking Curtis and Peter the same question. If you could, both of you covered public officials for a long time, if you could offer Trump, Curtis, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Yeah. Tell the truth for a change.
Okay, and Peter, what would be your piece of advice?
I would just say to that I shouldn't say that. Never mind. The thing I would advise him, I think it's probably the same thing that Mrs. Trump advises him, is lose the Twitter account, dude. I mean, really?
Yeah.
It's not like we don't know how you think about things, but some of the stuff you say, and again, this whole conversation reflects that. I mean, very little of this conversation had to do with Trump's governance. Most of it has to do with Trump's blah blah. Again, read the transcript of this Ukrainian thing, and it is. He used to promise in the last conversation I had with him last winter. He reiterated this completely Trumpian thing. I can be presidential. I can be presidential. I can be more presidential than any president since Abraham Lincoln, except for the pipe stove hat. But I can be presidential. Well, the fact is, I don't think he can be presidential in the way that we think of it. If he could be, he might win re-election by acclamation. But as it is, it's going to be, it's going to be very close, and Curtis might actually be the vote that decides it in his favor.
Well, not in his favor. I knew we'd have a lively session tonight, and there are 13 more months before the election. And I can assure you, in this building, journalism building, and in this Overby Center, there are going to be lots more discussions about Trump and the
13
presidency. Peter, you've given us a good, provocative view that we don't often hear from this stage, and we thank you for coming tonight.
Thank
and
you.
Curtis, we thank you as always.
Thank you. Thank you.